Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Donald C. Stewart.
I'm Andrew Wilson, and welcome to our full Scottish special.
Good evening and welcome to this evening's full Scottish specials. I am delighted to be joined here in the studio at Broadcasting Scotland by Andrew Wilson. Andrew, it's great to see you again tonight.
And you too, Donald. Again, Merry Christmas.
Indeed, and Merry Christmas. It may be a running theme, who's to know. We are tonight going to be turning our attention to the Tory leadership, which has been a bit of a movable feast, which is perhaps a bit of a metaphor for the current festivities that are ongoing between what we've had in Turkey and what we might be heading towards in terms of a good Scots steak pie for New Year. However, let's start by, at the beginning of 2022, we had a man in a position of power that slowly and surely people were beginning to see a facade crumble. But he had still got quite a long way to go. In terms of our reflection upon Boris Johnson as a leader, what do you think history is going to provide us as context and judgment?
Well, I think firstly what struck me was that at the beginning of 2022, we were beginning to see in some quarters and in some areas, both within the Conservative Party and more widely in our society, that there was a growing recognition that the Emperor was not wearing any clothes. That people had been persuaded that he was clothed, and that slowly, and I would probably argue inevitably, as Johnson from time to time was held up to the, admittedly, only the palest of light of examination, both in terms of his behaviour, past and present, his behaviour as Prime Minister, his notorious determination not to work very hard, his determination not to be on top of his briefs, his determination not to treat matters seriously, and his determination, if at all possible, to make a joke out of everything. I think that when combined with the results of his approach to being Prime Minister, the catastrophic death toll during the pandemic in the United Kingdom, far outstripping the vast majority of equivalent nations. I'm thinking in my mind, I'm thinking in particular of Japan, which has a population twice of the UK and had a death toll of just over 10,000, whereas we have had a death toll in the UK of more than 220,000, and it is still going up. So I think as those facts and the reality of the situation of having Boris Johnson at the helm in a serious storm, I think that began to dawn on people. And then, of course, as facts started to come out, as they tend to do, even with a client journalist class in Westminster who are wedded to the idea of a Conservative government and wedded to an idea of supporting a Conservative government, even they occasionally break out into actual journalism, and inevitably a little bit of the truth will out. And so I'm not surprised that Johnson's time ran out. I'm perhaps a little surprised that he lasted as long as he did, but I think at the beginning of 2022, the writing was, and I'm going to horribly mix metaphors here, the writing was beginning to appear on the wall that time was running out.
It was an interesting thing during during 2022. I listened to a Times podcast. And in it, they had interviewed people from working class constituencies in Yorkshire. I think it was Yorkshire. And what was coming through constantly was people calling Boris Johnson one of us, as if this old Etonian millionaire buffer had as much in common with a Yorkshire mother trying to work out how she could afford a loaf of bread and a pint of milk, knowing the cost of each. How did he do it? How did he manage to fool the people so well that he ended up in the position he was in?
Well, I think there's an element of the dark arts of communication, in particular political communication. I mean, there is a school of thought that in terms of the move towards Brexit as a thing, if I can put it in those terms. Johnson's role as the Brussels correspondent for the Daily Telegraph through the 90s was a fundamental part in the rise of the identification of Brussels as being the enemy that the Tories wanted to have for that decade and more. So I think it's fair to say that despite his determination to use Greek when it's singularly inappropriate, or Latin, or both, he has a communication skill, and that communication skill was polished and burnished and boosted by the client classes in Westminster, in particular the owners of the print media that still operate in England and Wales in particular. That he had literally been their employee for a couple of decades, so they knew what they were dealing with, and they recognised, I think, that he was somebody that if they manipulated him and presented him in a satisfactory way, something that Johnson was obviously very happy to do, especially if there was money in it for him, then I think that path was inevitable. It is said that his famous, what was presented at the time as a gaffe of becoming caught on the zip wire when he was Mayor of London over the Olympic site, it is said seriously now by those who were his security officers at the time that was deliberate.
Set up.
That the man was the man's approach to politics and to his career. Well, his approach to his career was deadly serious, but his approach to the representation of his career was that of a clown. And that's great, but there are almost inevitably tears at some point when there's clowning around involved.
So, in a sense, if I go back to mixing metaphors and go back to our Greek and Latin days, beware the Boris bearing gifts, in a sense. But a remarkable period of time, and if one clown was to leave the circus, the ring mistress, or the ring master, depending upon her gender politics, was to appear. And I did in this very studio reflect upon the fact that Liz Truss, along with a certain Brian Clough, managed 44 days of significant turmoil within an English institution. One was the champions of England in a footballing sense. At
the damned United.
Indeed. And one was in the damned Downing Street. It was a torrid election to get her in. It seemed to almost go on as long as a pandemic did. What do we think of Liz Truss at the end?
Well, it's a very interesting point that you made at that time, and you remind me of now. And we need to go and work out who the Billy Bremner was in Downing Street while Liz Truss was Prime Minister, and we'll need to go and do that. It doesn't immediately strike me. However, to come back to your point, with regard to Liz Truss, I think it's recognised that I think what comes to light, she was not a newspaper columnist, and I have a particular bee in my bonnet about newspaper columnists who become politicians, so she was not that. However, I think it's apparent that with the slightest of scrutiny, that it would become apparent that her history working in the oil industry would inform heavily part of her politics. Her rise to power within the Conservative government, rising without trace, as some people would say, it was an indication that the only thing that mattered to her was pursuit of power and pursuit of her career, and that somebody who had been a Republican and who was now a monarchist, who had been a Lib Dem supporter and now was a hardest of hard right Tory, it was an indication that in a similar way as to how we were discussing the lack of an anchor for Boris Johnson, that there was no anchor for her either in terms of beliefs or in policy or in experience. The only anchor was pursuing her own personal ambition as a politician, and that as a result of those two things then combined with the at the time fairly clear civil war within the Conservative Party, which I think it's arguable has not been settled yet. There's maybe a little bit less shooting at the moment, but the ongoing civil war within right-wing politics in the UK, I think it was apparent that she was going to really struggle as Prime Minister because of the lack of support in the amongst Conservative MPs, let alone amongst the wider country, and that as a result, her ambition and her determination to move quickly and break things was going to come a cropper when she handed the responsibility for the economy to Kwasi Kwarteng, and between the two of them, over a few days, cooked up something which it is suggested it's going to cost us 6 years to pay for.
It's an astonishing thing. If we ever work out who was Billy Bremner, there's a film in there. I wonder if Ken Branagh would be available to reprise his role. That Kwasi Kwarteng, Liz Truss, the fiscal announcement, of course, they couldn't call it a budget because they're in the Office of Budget Responsibility. Yet another thing, last night we were talking about COVID, and I was suggesting that there was new wordage that had come into our orbit in terms of politics. But here was an organisation that suddenly became centre. And one of the words in there, of course, is responsibility. And what there seemed to be lacking in almost every day of this was a lack of responsibility, to the point at which there was this absurd view of a vote that was a motion of no confidence or a motion of confidence, or it wasn't either, it could be both, or it was to be, and somebody was going to, then they weren't resigning, and it just seemed to be chaos. And in the middle of it, the beacon in Scotland of light for everything was the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, who was clear that Boris Johnson should resign and Boris Johnson should stay, that Liz Truss should do what she's doing and we should all follow what Kwasi Kwarteng. And wait a minute. I'm really glad that they've decided to U-turn. This seemed to be an utterly directionless period of time, and we all suffered from it.
I think that's right, and directionless is perhaps a good metaphor for that. I was thinking about how Dominic Cummings described Boris Johnson as being a wonky shopping trolley, rattling down the aisles, bouncing from side to side. And I wonder if, in some sense, Liz Truss's approach to Downing Street was inspired by that, and she thought, well, that seemed to work for Johnson for a while, so I'll be even more or even less directed or even more directionless, depending how you look at it. And I will dispense with all of the guardrails. I will dispense with everything, and we'll just see where this ends up. And that perhaps suggests the background to her determination not to follow the very limited, very pale guidelines that there are for conduct, and that as a result it took the markets. And I still struggle to work out how and why, but it took the markets to then blow the whistle on what was going on and make it plain that this experiment with the UK economy, which a number of people had called out at the time as being up to and including Joe Biden, I think, had said it was a crazy experiment with the UK economy. I think I think Johnson perhaps, or the way in which Johnson ran his government, and through of which Liz Truss was the longest serving member, I think there's perhaps evidence that she was inspired by the Johnsonian approach to life, but that then was turbocharged by her determination. Perhaps, as you were making the point, Rishi Sunak feels he's got perhaps a couple of years, perhaps 18 months, maybe, of runway to get to the next election. She maybe felt that, in a sense, that it was the same challenge for her, and she wanted to get on with the job. And the way to do that was to throw all the manuals out the window and just fly the aircraft as best that she and Kwasi thought that they could, despite neither of them having the necessary certifications or experience to actually fly the aircraft.
Indeed, and the idea of a wonky trolley, and joining that with the clown analogy, obviously it was a clown car, and the longest serving mechanic in the clown car was Liz Truss. But of course, what then happened was that to steady the ship, in came Jeremy Hunt, and what he did was he unpacked the whole thing and he started to change it back to the way in which it apparently was supposed to be in the first place. And lo and behold, when Liz Truss felt that she could not deliver, how she thought she ever could deliver was a mystery to everybody apart from anybody in number 10 who was in temporary residence. We ended up with the opportunity for Boris Johnson to come back. He was talking of returning. I think last night I was talking about Nigel Farage and his connection to our Jesus Christ resurrection. This was perhaps more Lazarus in its attempt to gain the 100 votes. I've got the 100 votes, I can come in, but for unity, he must have been appraised of the fact that it wouldn't have been seen very positively. But Penny Mordaunt versus Rishi Sunak, and it seemed to go a heck of a lot quicker for reasons which we can understand. But I don't think it's got anything to do with the needs of the country. I think it's got to do with the needs of the Conservative Party feeling as though they look as though they know what they're doing. I think it was Baroness Worsey in Channel 4's last leg had gone on about, it's so appalling. We used to be the government that at least could handle the economy, and we can't even do that now. So even the most ardent supporters were losing faith. And then we get Sunak. Is he going to be the one who restores their faith?
Well, I was reflecting there the point we were discussing earlier about the length of time that the leadership campaign that brought Truss to power, how, as you say, it went on and on and on for the summer, at a time when perhaps running the country might have been a good idea, but the Conservatives were too busy fighting a civil war and ignoring what was happening in the rest of the world as usual. I think there was perhaps a recognition that length of campaign exposed how thin and how pale conservatism had become in England in particular. And also it opened up room for the candidates to attempt to outright wing each other. And as a result of that leadership campaign, the party moved to the right, the parliamentary party moved to the right, encouraged by the press, undoubtedly. And as a result, it was setting up, in a sense, it was one of the causes of the car crash that we then saw, the air crash that we then saw with Truss's government. She having felt that she was empowered to adopt ever more extreme positions during the election campaign in order to secure the votes of Daily Mail reading pensioners in the southeast of England, and still not to secure the support of her MPs, who continued not to support her campaign, I suspect because they knew what she was like and they could see what was going to happen. I think the way in which the shallowness of the talent puddle in the Conservative Party and in the Tory cabinet was exposed during the leadership campaign in the summer of this year ought to have been a louder and brighter warning signal to everyone as to what was likely going to happen. And the other signal, I think, was the determination of Truss and Kwarteng to not to listen to those who would speak truth to power. The sacking of the Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, the removal of other civil servants, the ongoing campaign to demean and belittle senior civil servants, as they would be described by Cummings and his acolytes as the blob. And lo, when things that senior civil servants would have been strongly advising against are done, it's not a surprise that there is then a catastrophic result. I'm not suggesting that the British civil service is a Rolls Royce. I'm not, and I'm not suggesting that it has the answers to everything. But I think the collective learning and the collective experience of the civil service, especially in Whitehall, and in Holyrood, recognises that it knows the signs of a catastrophe when they are building, and it seeks to prevent that catastrophe, which is in sharp contrast to current Conservative politicians who, it's maybe the case that they still have the taste for the catastrophe that comes from dislocations like Brexit, and the way in which that allows them to, they would think, to pursue political agendas without actually having to discuss them properly and lay them out for the electors. It's about bouncing from catastrophe to catastrophe and potentially using that as a distraction while enriching themselves or their friends and their family, and planning their exit from Westminster and which bank they're going to work for next.
I find it, astonishing that the Conservative Party attacked the establishment. The senior civil servants were mocked and ridiculed, privately, leading to spills into the public domain, which just seems, and the idea that Dominic Raab is still facing the possibility of these allegations of his own misconduct. Misconduct in a public office for a Conservative who has been a Conservative for most of his life is the equivalent of the Labour Party having a millionaire backer. It seems to be a point at which it's gone completely mad.
I would agree, and possibly history. We've spoken a little bit about the history of politics in the 1980s, and I'm wondering if the lessons here at the moment are possibly, in some sense, lessons from politics in the 1990s, as we saw the Conservative talent puddle dry up under John Major after success as he took over from Mrs. Thatcher, and we saw a number of Conservative politicians get the jail for their misbehaviour and their misconduct. And so I'm not suggesting that we'll see the current crop, that's the current half glass full of Conservative ministers. I'm not suggesting that we will see them getting the jail yet. I'm wondering whether that process might be informed as to the success of the Justice Department in the United States in bringing the former president to justice. That might present some interesting mood music, but I think it may well be the case that we are seeing the extreme examples of a government running out of steam, running out of thought of policy, running out of people who are able to express policy and implement policy. I was trying to think of a policy, yesterday I was reflecting, trying to think of a policy that has actually been successfully implemented by this Conservative government in Westminster, and I struggle to find one, to be entirely honest. And so I'm wondering if we're seeing the inevitable collapse that or a repetition of the collapse of a Conservative administration that we saw under John Major. And of course, that, to bring it back to Scotland, that stands in ever sharper contrast to the position of the Scottish government, with a First Minister here who's seen David Cameron, who's seen Theresa May, who's seen Boris Johnson, who's seen Liz Truss, and has now seen Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. And the SNP's polling appears to remain firm, if not growing slightly, under the last 8 or 9 polls. And the First Minister's approval rating continues to be the highest of any senior politician in the British Isles.
You would expect, I often wonder if Nicola Sturgeon has been given for Christmas these kind of Russian dolls with each of the Prime Ministers in it that she has outlasted.
If she hasn't, she should be.
Well, indeed. I think I may put that on my list. One of the interesting aspects of all this, I suppose, is just what you've pointed out. After a decade in power, it is normal that within a parliamentary grouping, you've run out of those people that you can put into junior ministership and then up the ranks towards the cabinet. And you described it as a puddle very effectively, because that is exactly what it is. You begin, and I think that the Labour Party in Scotland for many years suffered from that. Precisely. That they looked round to see who was going to, after particularly Donald Dewar passed away, looking for who was going to take over that mantle, and really did struggle.
Oh, and we've got Jackie Baillie as an MSP, exactly.
Well, indeed. And what we end up with is, quite understandably, a government who are struggling to fill the positions with people who are likely to inspire. But what they got was people who just made everybody perspire and sweat at what was coming next. And now, there is the return of the likes of Jeremy Hunt and so on, and perhaps those who were put out to grass because they were not part of the Trussonomics, not part of the Johnson vision, whatever that funfair ride may turn out to be. Coming to somewhere run by Disney soon. But I wonder, in comparison, when you look at what's happened in Scotland, that I am comforted by the fact that every time there is somebody who's going to leave the Scottish government, there seems to be somebody there who's going to see the change of finance secretary at one point, who's now off on maternity leave. We saw when Ian Blackford, a very decent performer in the House of Commons, and we've got an alternative. And two decent alternatives, not two that we are struggling to worry about which one's going to get it. And I just cannot understand, or maybe I can, maybe I know exactly why the likes of, because I said earlier on, perspiration rather than inspiration, that it's a worry rather than a comfort.
Yes.
The cream that rises to the top might not be cream at all.
Well, I think that's a very fair point, and there's certainly a significant question round about this sounds a bit Calvinist, but the work ethic.
Nothing wrong with that.
Of the work ethic of in particular of Conservative ministers in Westminster. As you mentioned Dominic Raab, who appears to spend his whole time shouting at people about documents not being formatted to his choice, and winding up the rest of us people who are humans and so who are quite attracted to the idea of human rights, which he appears to reject as an idea. So yes, I think there is and that is in sharp contrast. You mentioned the finance secretary, who, as you say, is on maternity leave at the moment. She took over that brief with 48 hours notice, and is regarded as having done an excellent job in assuming the role, and has continued to do so. As you say, there was a changing of the guard, perhaps in the SNP Westminster group, with a new leader and deputy leader, a new chief whip, all of whom are in their 30s, and many of whom are regular contributors to Broadcasting Scotland programmes, and so I think there is a contrast there. Although I suppose that one other aspect, reflecting upon it a little bit at least, it may be the most extreme example, but I think it certainly relates to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. One would expect that at some point, and this I'm not going to delve into the analysis of their psychology, but at some point for the likes of multimillionaire Rishi Sunak and multimillionaire Jeremy Hunt, the grind of daily politics, especially in the face of a Conservative government that has run out of road, has run out of steam, has run out of ideas, and is by some of the reporting now is starting to run out of funders, which I think possibly that might speak loudest in Conservative circles. It's the money. It's the money that makes a difference. So I think there is the prospect of an even sharper contrast between Scottish politics, both the solidity and the solidity and the hard work that we see in Holyrood, especially from senior politicians, and the determination and dynamism that we see from the Westminster group, which stands in sharp contrast both to the performance of unionist parties in Holyrood and the performance of the opposition parties in Westminster.
One simple question before we go. Andrew, yes or no, will Rishi Sunak be the Prime Minister this time next year?
No.
Well, there you are. You heard it from here. Us first. Andrew, thank you very much for tonight. It's been an absolute delight and a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure, Donald. Thank you for having me.
And that's all we've got time for. And before I go, just Reverend Brownlee, all those many years in the Ayr United We Free Church of Scotland weren't wasted. I managed to get Calvinism in somewhere. Thank you again, Andrew. Good night.
Good night.
Well, that is it for this evening. But before we go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So, to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have launched our new crowdfunder with a target of £30,000 to enable us to pay our bills and continue to make programmes. So please donate whatever you can afford. We can only continue with the support of our viewers. Good night and thank you for watching. Bye for now.